The brutality of medieval winters, life in a freezer. Ever pondered how existence unfolded during medieval winters? It was essentially nature's method of wishing you the best of luck, navigating truly harsh conditions. While fairy tales often depict idyllic scenes of snug castles and toasty firesides, the stark reality for peasants more closely resembled residing within the planet's most frigid icebox. When your day commenced before daybreak in a dwelling that felt colder than a frosty reception from someone you've wronged, you were acutely aware of the arduous day that lay ahead. To truly grasp the severity of this, while we currently grumble about our heating expenses or when the thermostat dips below 65 degrees Fahrenheit, medieval peasants faced genuinely brutal conditions. According to documented historical accounts, winter temperatures across medieval Europe could plummet to spine-tingling depths, occasionally hitting a frigid degrees Fahrenheit in regions such as England and northern France. This level of cold is sufficient to freeze your footwear to the ground, a phenomenon that, in fact, transpired more frequently than one might imagine. Hay beds improvise comfort and surprising insulation. The daily grind commenced before sunrise, with peasants reluctantly extricating themselves from their icy beds to attend to livestock or whatever duties demanded execution. One medieval scribe noted that peasants would frequently awaken with frost coating their eyebrows. Talk about a natural, albeit chilly, medieval wake-up call. Speaking of beds, the rudimentary sleeping arrangements of that era were quite astonishing. Their beds were essentially massive heaps of hay and straw, haphazardly piled onto the floor. The medieval iteration of a do-it-yourself project gone slightly awry. However, these improvised beds actually function more effectively than you might initially assume. Recent archaeological investigations of medieval peasant dwellings have indicated that these hay beds could reach thicknesses of up to 2 feet. That's akin to possessing a king-size mattress constructed entirely from farm byproducts. Peasants would gather fresh hay throughout the summer months, stockpiling additional bundles specifically designated for winter bedding. They would layer it sufficiently thick to elevate themselves above the frigid ground. A crucial measure considering that the majority of peasant homes had dirt floors that transformed into miniature freezers during winter. Each morning, they were obligated to shake out their bedding, an activity that could unveil some rather intriguing surprises. From mice establishing cozy nests overnight to insects treating their bed as an all-you-can-eat buffet, peasants were perpetually uncertain about what they might unearth. One medieval text recounts a peasant who discovered a chicken had deposited an egg in his bed while he was asleep. Now that's what you call breakfast in bed. However, the true ingenuity of hay beds resided in their inherent insulation capabilities. When densely packed, hay could trap pockets of air that functioned like nature's bubble wrap, preventing warmth from dissipating into the cold earth beneath. Peasants would frequently augment their hay with any supplementary materials they could procure: old garments, worn-out blankets, and even desiccated moss. During particularly frigid nights, they would replenish their beds with fresh hay from their reserves, as compressed hay gradually lost its insulating efficacy over time. The disadvantage? Hay beds were essentially colossal sponges for dampness. In the humid medieval climate, they could become rather musty, and if you suffered from allergies, well, let's just say antihistamines weren't readily available at the local apothecary. One historical account details a nobleman who was compelled to spend a night in a peasant's abode, and he lamented for weeks about how the hay bed induced such intense sneezing fits that he genuinely feared his nose might detach. Yet hay beds weren't exclusively for slumber. They also served as seating during daylight hours. When visitors arrived, assuming they ever did, everyone would congregate on these hay piles as if they were medieval beanbags. Though it's doubtful anyone was labeling them rustic chic in that era, and while these beds might sound less than luxurious, they did possess one advantage over contemporary mattresses. Bedbugs exhibited a preference for fabric over hay. Wool, the medieval superhero suit against hypothermia. However, there was one material that medieval peasants practically inhabited throughout winter: wool. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of a superhero costume, except instead of combating villains, it battled hypothermia. Medieval peasants depended on wool to such an extent that historians estimate a single family might have possessed upwards of 20 pounds of wool clothing. That's roughly the heft of a small toddler, except this particular toddler kept you warm and occasionally induced intense itching. The truly captivating aspect of wool was the method by which peasants acquired it. Each spring, local shepherds would shear their sheep, and peasants would procure or barter for the raw wool. But here's where it becomes intriguing. They didn't simply don it directly, as we do with modern wool sweaters. The wool necessitated processing, which entailed countless hours of cleansing, carding, and spinning. And you thought doing laundry nowadays was a chore. Here's an amusing tidbit that will enhance your appreciation for your contemporary attire. Medieval wool still retained lanolin, the natural oil from sheep which rendered the fabric water-resistant. Granted, it emitted an aroma of damp sheep when it rained, but at least water tended to bead and roll off. Some ingenious peasants realized that preserving extra lanolin in the wool ensured they remained drier, though they likely weren't vying for any medieval fashion accolades or receiving invitations to dine at the castle. Medieval peasants seldom laundered their wool garments, and for once they had a perfectly valid rationale. Damp wool in sub-zero temperatures is a surefire recipe for transforming into a human popsicle. One medieval record recounts a peasant who washed his wool coat in winter and discovered it frozen so solid that it could stand upright unaided. Subsequently, it became a local jest, as stiff as John's winter washing. However, wool wasn't flawless. For one, it attracted fleas with unparalleled enthusiasm. Medieval peasants would frequently hang their wool clothing near the smoke emanating from their fires, hoping the smoke would deter these minuscule, unwelcome lodgers. The downside? They ended up smelling like a blend of sheep and campfire. Medieval peasant perfume, if you will. The remarkable properties of wool truly shone during the most severe winter storms. While contemporary tests have demonstrated that wet wool can still maintain warmth even when saturated, retaining approximately 80% of its insulating capacity, peasants didn't require scientific validation. They lived this reality. They would trudge through blizzards resembling walking haystacks enveloped in layer upon layer of the material. But a solitary piece of wool clothing was never adequate in the brutal medieval winters. These resourceful peasants devised a solution that would make any contemporary fashion aficionado cringe. Because in the medieval world, the prevailing fashion principle was straightforward. If you could still move your arms freely, you hadn't donned sufficient attire yet. Layering mastery, the medieval art of dressing for extreme cold. Peasants didn't merely wear layers, they mastered the art of resembling a mobile wardrobe. Archaeological findings from medieval sites indicate that the average peasant would don between 4 to 7 layers of clothing during the most frigid days, which probably made them appear as if they'd raided every clothesline in the vicinity. Let's dissect this medieval sartorial extravaganza. First came the base layer, a lengthy linen shirt extending down to their knees. Over this, they'd add a wool tunic, then another tunic, because why limit oneself to just one? Followed by a jerkin, which is merely a fancy term for a sleeveless jacket. If they were fortunate enough to possess one, they might also throw on a fur-lined cloak. The entire ensemble was frequently cinched together with a rope belt, primarily to prevent all those layers from sliding off, rather than for any fashion statement. Modern scientists have ascertained that multiple thin layers are more effective at trapping warm air than a single thick layer. Peasants likely deduced this through trial and error. Mostly error, probably, and a multitude of frostbitten toes along the way. The genuine predicament arose when nature called. With all those layers, a swift trip to the outhouse transformed into an epic undertaking. Historical records from the era mention individuals abstaining from drinking water in winter, solely to circumvent the entire undressing and redressing ordeal. Talk about commitment to staying warm. Children face particularly challenging circumstances. Parents would encase them in so many layers that they would waddle about like diminutive, tipsy penguins. One medieval writer jested that you could always identify the children in winter. They were the rotund bundles tumbling down village hills, incapable of bending their knees sufficiently to walk properly. The chimneyless hearth, a smoky center of heat and life. Even with all these layers, peasants still required supplementary measures to remain warm. This brings us to the most indispensable feature of any medieval dwelling, a feature that could either preserve your life or saturate your lungs with smoke. A fireplace, if you could even legitimately call it that. In reality, it was merely a fire pit situated in the center of the room, with smoke meandering wherever it pleased. Medieval architects hadn't quite mastered the concept of chimneys yet, which implied that the majority of homes possessed a delightful ambiance of perpetually smoked meat, including the occupants themselves. Archaeological excavations have unveiled an intriguing detail. The average medieval home featured a fire pit approximately 3 feet in diameter, encircled by stones. However, only about 15% of the heat actually remained within the room. The remainder ascended directly through openings in the roof, which were ostensibly intended to vent smoke but primarily served to admit snowfall. Medieval peasants essentially conceived the world's most inefficient heating system. The amusement truly commenced when it came to procuring fuel. Forget about neatly seasoned firewood. That was exclusively for the affluent. Peasants incinerated whatever combustible materials they could lay their hands on. Old furniture, into the fire, last year's broken tools, perfect fuel. Your neighbor's fence that mysteriously vanished overnight. Hey, what transpires in medieval winter remains in medieval winter. Records from one English village document a group of peasants who, during a particularly severe winter, systematically burned an entire abandoned barn piece by piece. The local lord wasn't particularly pleased about that episode. Igniting the fire each morning was a veritable escapade. They would attempt to keep a solitary coal alive overnight, concealed within ashes. Losing it necessitated a profoundly cold trek to borrow fire from a neighbor. One medieval anecdote recounts a man who had to transport a hot coal home in a hollowed-out turnip, as he lacked any other suitable receptacle. He sprinted with such haste to keep it alight that onlookers mistook him for being pursued by demons. The smoke was both a boon and a bane. Certainly it induced watery eyes in everyone, and likely curtailed years from their lifespans. But it also repelled insects and inadvertently preserved the roof timbers. Contemporary analysis of surviving medieval timbers reveals they were, in fact, shielded by the layers of soot that accumulated over decades. It's probably not a preservation technique you'll encounter in contemporary home improvement guides. Each family possessed their Nedgeby methods for managing the fire. Some would sleep in shifts to sustain it throughout the night. Others developed elaborate systems for banking the coals just right. Many believed that whispering to the fire while adding fuel would enhance its combustion, though that might have merely been the smoke-inducing a slightly delirious state. Following a long day of striving not to freeze or succumb to smoke inhalation, medieval peasants also required sustenance to warm their insides. Winter stew, a culinary mystery in a pot. Their dinner menus for medieval winters were akin to participating in a truly bizarre rendition of What's in the Pot? Research indicates that the average peasant family had access to roughly 7 to 8 basic ingredients that they utilized throughout the entire winter. Predominantly, these were root vegetables that appeared as if they'd been cultivated in a dragon's garden. Turnips, parsnips, and something termed neeps, which honestly sounds more like a medieval ailment than a vegetable, were the culinary stars. The cooking procedure was virtually identical each day. Toss everything into a pot, add water, and pray it transforms into something palatable. This pot would suspend over the fire throughout the day, with family members periodically adding whatever edible items they could procure. Historians have unearthed records of some genuinely imaginative additions: tree bark for fiber, pebbles for minerals, and even leather for protein. One medieval account mentions a family who became so desperate that they attempted to cook their wooden spoon, asserting that it imparted flavor. It's also intriguing how they incorporated wild herbs and plants. Medieval peasants were akin to walking encyclopedias of edible flora. They possessed precise knowledge of which winter herbs could enhance the flavor of their stews, or at least mask the taste of that 3-day-old mystery meat. One popular herb was something termed poor man's pepper, a plant that grew wild and could render even a boot somewhat palatable if utilized in sufficient quantities. Animal roommates, sharing space for warmth and survival. At nightfall, families would congregate around their perpetual stew pot, sharing the day's gossip and attempting to disregard whatever unidentifiable objects might be floating in their dinner. But they weren't solitary in their cozy abodes. They had some unexpected roommates keeping them warm. Studies of medieval house layouts reveal that up to 30% of living space was shared with animals during winter. That's correct. Chickens, pigs, sheep, and even cows became temporary indoor companions when temperatures plummeted. These animal arrangements weren't arbitrary. Each creature possessed its own distinct heating properties. Cows, for instance, could generate as much heat as a small fireplace, approximately 5,000 BTUs per hour. Medieval peasants were unfamiliar with BTUs, but they intuitively knew that sleeping adjacent to Bessie, the cow, meant awakening with all their toes still intact. Pigs were akin to portable heaters, chickens were feathered foot warmers, and sheep were essentially ambulatory blankets of wool. Naturally, this arrangement presented some intriguing challenges. You haven't truly experienced pandemonium until you've attempted to eat dinner with an inquisitive pig endeavoring to insert its snout into your bowl. Archaeological evidence indicates that many peasant homes had low barriers constructed to confine animals to specific areas, though based on historical accounts, these barriers were more akin to polite suggestions that the animals comprehensively disregarded. The nighttime symphony was particularly noteworthy. Between the cows mooing, the pigs snoring, and the chickens' random midnight pronouncements, medieval peasants likely invented the art of sleeping through cacophony out of sheer necessity. One humorous anecdote from a traveling merchant describes lodging at a peasant's house and being convinced that the rooster harbored a personal vendetta against him. It persisted in crowing directly into his ear every time he began to doze off. However, these animal roommates served multiple purposes beyond being living heaters. They provided an early warning system against thieves. Try sneaking past a paranoid goose, and their respiration aided in maintaining room humidity, which actually enhanced the perceived warmth. Scientists have corroborated that a properly humid room feels 3 to 4 degrees warmer than a dry one. Medieval peasants might not have grasped the scientific principles, but they knew it was effective. Some peasants even developed specific housing ordinances for their animals. Chickens might secure window-adjacent spots to capture the first light and rouse everyone, while larger animals remained near the back wall, where their body heat could reflect off the stone. It was like a medieval rendition of a homeowners association, just with a greater volume of manure to contend with. Subterranean homes, underground fortresses against the cold. Ingenious as these indoor arrangements were, peasants still needed to shield themselves from the brutal winter weather when they ventured outdoors. Their solution? They transformed their dwellings into miniature fortresses against the cold, employing some remarkably creative building techniques. Essentially, they took their typical medieval house, bisected it, and buried the lower half underground. This clever design furnished extra insulation, keeping the cold at bay while they huddled within. Archaeological excavations have unearthed evidence that nearly 40% of peasant homes in northern Europe were partially submerged in the earth. These weren't precisely luxurious basement apartments, but they were onto something exceptionally astute. The ground temperature remains relatively stable at approximately 50 to 55 degrees once you descend a few feet. Contemporary scientists term this geothermal stability, but medieval peasants simply referred to it as common sense. They would excavate approximately 3 to 4 feet down, construct their walls from that point, and ultimately possess a dwelling that remained warmer in winter and cooler in summer. It was akin to having medieval air conditioning, minus the air in the conditioning. Building materials consisted of whatever they could procure: straw, mud, stones, wood. If it could constitute a wall, they employed it. Some particularly resourceful peasants would pilfer stones from ancient Roman ruins, resulting in houses that were part medieval hovel, part ancient empire. The local lords weren't particularly enamored with this architectural recycling program, but hey, when you're freezing, a stone is a stone. Doors were another captivating feature. Most peasant homes possessed only a single door, and it typically faced away from the prevailing wind. This wasn't merely random, it was medieval engineering at its zenith. They would frequently construct a diminutive entrance tunnel, somewhat akin to what you'd observe in an igloo. One medieval account depicted it as entering through a dragon's throat, though given the odors emanating from all those indoor animals, that might not have been an exaggeration. Roofs were layered like the world's most extravagant sandwich. Branches, straw, more branches, more straw, and occasionally even chunks of turf. In certain locales, peasants would permit grass to proliferate on their roofs, not in an attempt to pioneer medieval green architecture, but because the roots aided in binding everything together. Plus, their goats could graze up there if they were feeling adventurous. Winter tool arsenal, essential gear for outdoor survival. A well-constructed dwelling was merely half the battle against winter's fury. To venture outdoors, peasants required a specialized ensemble of tools that would elicit envy from contemporary survival experts. And indeed, they possessed a veritable arsenal. Archaeological discoveries reveal that the average peasant owned approximately 6 to 8 essential winter tools, each meticulously maintained and passed down through generations. These weren't merely tools, they were the demarcation between survival and transformation into a human icicle. The snow shovel reigned supreme among winter tools, yet it bore no resemblance to its modern counterpart. Fashioned from a single piece of hardwood with a broad, flat end, these medieval shovels were actually more efficacious at displacing heavy snow than contemporary plastic versions. Tests on recreated medieval shovels demonstrate they could move about 30% more snow per scoop. Naturally, they also weighed approximately as much as a small child, so wielding one was akin to engaging in CrossFit medieval style. Thick socks were literally worth their weight in gold. Records from one medieval market indicate that a pair of well-crafted winter socks could command a price equivalent to a chicken. These weren't your run-of-the-mill wool socks either. Peasants would interweave strips of rabbit fur between the wool layers, fashioning nature's own winter boots. One medieval writer grumbled that his feet became so overheated in these socks that he feared they might spontaneously combust. The most captivating tool was something termed a snow scorer, a lengthy stick employed to delineate paths in deep snow. Peasants would strategically plant these sticks along frequently traveled routes before major storms struck. An intelligent maneuver, considering that becoming lost in a medieval blizzard was akin to participating in an exceedingly cold rendition of hide-and-seek, a game nobody aspired to win. Historical records mention one village that adorned their snow scorers with diverse hues of berry juice to conceive the world's inaugural medieval GPS system. But the undisputed MVP of medieval winter gear was the humble mitten, not gloves, mittens. They discerned what scientists only substantiated centuries later. Keeping your fingers congregated generates more warmth than separating them. These weren't store-bought mittens either. Peasants would stuff them with everything from desiccated moss to chicken feathers. One imaginative soul even crafted mittens stuffed with cat hair. Talk about recycling. Tools had to be primed for immediate deployment. Medieval weather forecasting primarily consisted of gazing at the sky and hoping for the best. Medieval winter wisdom, resourcefulness in the face of freeze. They did possess some surprisingly accurate predictive methodologies, though. If the cows within the house, remember them, began exhibiting extra cuddliness, a storm was imminent. When pigs amassed extra straw, frigid weather was on the horizon. It wasn't precisely the Weather Channel, but it proved effective. These ingenious medieval solutions underscore just how resourceful individuals can become when survival hangs in the balance. From subterranean dwellings to animal roommates, from perpetual stews to fur-lined socks, medieval peasants authored their own survival manual, one freezing winter at a time.